Welcome to another episode of the Commute Me podcast, a conversational podcast exploring the stories, insights, and strategies behind learning-centric communities. Our mission is to inspire listeners by highlighting individuals who are shaping the future of how people come together to learn, grow, and thrive. I'm excited to welcome Will Fan, the CEO and head of school at New Campus, a modern business school for a world in flux. Based in Singapore, New Campus helps companies across Southeast Asia and beyond build modern learning cultures with live classes, coaching, and curriculum designed for hypergrowth. In addition to being an entrepreneur and founder, Will is also an angel investor whose passion sits at the intersection of learning and global talent. Whether he's advising startups or rethinking business education, Will is animated by a central question: how do we help people grow in the flow of work, not outside of it? Well, it's awesome to have you join the podcast today. How are you doing?
And appreciate being here.
So let's dive right in, Will. I know doing a basic introduction is just that, a basic overview of someone's background. I'd love for you to share a little bit about kind of how you came to found New Campus and the kinds of experiences maybe at a very high level that you had, which shaped the way that you are today.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. When you ask education founders how they got here, often it's going to be a whirlwind of different entry points, exit points. I'm in my 11th year of building New Campus now. I started this with my life partner, in 2014. But in 2014, it was a very different concept. It was actually trying to solve our own personal problem. How do you switch from your corporate career into alternative technology paths? And it was also a different name, QLC, quarter life crisis at the time. And that kind of evolved to serve so many different customer segments, whether it was direct to consumer. So we ran live co-learning room experiences with corporate professionals looking to upskill in digital. We expanded into the university space, so started selling these programs direct to universities in Australia, in Singapore, in the UK. And then we also spent some time in the Middle East and in China to build education services and programming there. Our major catalyst was, similar to a lot of other education businesses, which was the COVID boom. And it became an inflection point for us where we honed in on selling programs to business and rapidly grew our portfolio of clients to over 500 tech businesses in Southeast Asia. And so constantly refining, reiterating, and honing in on the management and leadership training space. So now fast forward to 2025, we serve over 18% of the tech businesses in the region, impacting over 130,000 learners. We also work very closely with a foundation partner, Open Campus, which invests, advisors, and strategically finances other education businesses all around the world. And then personally, really thinking about the future of education companies and how we can constantly innovate in this modern AI meets Web3 meets emerging markets world.
There's a lot to unpack there, Will, because I think a lot of us are thinking about these topics, and especially I think in the more American / maybe perhaps European market, there's a different conversation that might be happening in certain circles, but I think the commonality exists in terms of how do we create resilient workforces in the age of AI, right? How do we upskill? How do we future-proof? And there's this concept, at least even some of the guests that have been on the podcast, they've really emphasized the idea of not losing the human intelligence or the human component of learning experiences, even though we have all this technology that's kind of permeating all the different areas that people are engaged in. So what are the types of philosophies or frameworks maybe that you're really trying to champion at New Campus?
So we were one of the earliest companies that adopted remote working. This was out of, my founders and I coming from Australia to Singapore and, not being able to afford having an office. So we would just hop between cafes for years, visa runs for years. And that was actually a big question mark early fundraising period around, is this business legitimate? And so we kind of evolved that model over time and took pride in being one of the quote unquote innovators in business practice. And, it's I'm quite proud to say that a big portion of the team that have been with us since 2014 have now, continued to work with us. So 8, 9, 10 years later. We were one of the first companies that made a bet into the digital Zoom class space before the world started working on Zoom and Google Meets. And then even now, our company's still very lean, but we are punching above our weight, leveraging AI and tech. And so I think for us, it's really eating our own dog food, because trying to challenge the incumbent traditional training providers that have, major offices, big stacks of their workforce, and, still trying to think about what does disruption look like in their business. And so in having this part of our DNA, it's something that we practice and preach to our clients. It's something that we're seeing in verticals like e-commerce, in supply chain, in the fintech world for the markets that we serve: Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, MENA. And I think a big part of our philosophy does translate into how we think about what great business looks like. So Sam Altman made a quote a few months ago where you're probably going to see, the first one-person unicorn leveraging AI, and I do think that's a thesis that I'm leaning in quite heavily. How do you significantly reduce costs and reduce input by leveraging, ChatGPT or other, toolkits, but also increase the human interaction, which learning and community thrives on. So I think for us, we're still making a big bet on what community means, but you can essentially accelerate and improve the process and efficacy through tools like AI, through tech platforms, and so I do think the future business should be skinny, and I do think the future business should think long term around sustenance, which I believe during the VC heyday that was a very different mindset.
Yeah, and I think the important thing that I continuously am adapting and evolving my own understanding of how AI is able to augment and really amplify the impact of community, and how it can actually generate community to begin with. I'm always a bit unsure how much of AI tools can be used to bring people together. Perhaps it can be leveraged in the actual act of connection, in terms of, okay, you're now, because your personality or your skills are such and such, we can pair you with somebody or with a set of skills or with an experience that would complement the skill sets that you have, or maybe complement the skill sets you don't have. So there's a learning component to it, and there's an acquisition component to it. But I would love to understand how New Campus has actually approached community building, right? So it's exciting to hear that you were kind of pioneering this idea of synchronous but virtual experience. How has that evolved over time?
So when we entered the Web3 space, which was about 2.5, 3 years ago, uh, that's where we really found our home. Because prior to that, if you look at what community actually meant for a business, it was always a feature. It was always a alumni upsell strategy, and the only real community um, examples at the time was either Reddit, where you have your degens, or you Airbnb, where you have your high profiles and your super hosts. And for a very long time, we also questioned, why are we spending so much time with these learners when they've already purchased a course or we finished a program with them? But as we kind of fast forward 10 years into our business, a lot of these learners have come back. They've joined our company. We've partnered as business relationships. We've even seen them go through courses with us over and over, and it's actually quite hard to calculate and compute that in the early days of a early stage startup. You don't think that, hey, maybe someone like Farhan or someone like Will is going to be a business, part of your business for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so that's kind of evolving as we collect more data and build these relationships. I'm, in my late 30s now. And what's been quite powerful is seeing these relationships come back over time. And so I feel like any sort of human-centric business should take relationships seriously, which means you can aggressively automate your work, aggressively, streamline your back office, but then spend time having intimate conversations like this, whether it's IRL or, virtual through podcasts and whatnot. When it comes to how we've scaled our communities, we actually treat community as our first product. And that's why when I mentioned entering Web3, it's community first and then you find products later. And so that became a very nice combination of providing learning, upskilling, onboarding, offboarding opportunities, components, features that keep the communities coming in and out. I think looking forward, big bet again for new industries like AI, like Web3, allows us to think long term about the people involved and how we're going to be making bets into those people.
And then what are some of the misconceptions? I'm guessing, Will, that, over the course of having built a new campus and all the learnings that you've been able to extract over the last 10 years, have you noticed any trends around hesitations or fears or misconceptions that industry leaders are harboring or they have around this idea of upskilling in this new age?
I think content is now a commodity, and this is something that we don't need to it's a no-brainer for a lot of your listeners. If you scroll to LinkedIn, most of the time it is augmented versions of someone's voice pushed through ChatGPT. So what I'm very much appreciating is live content and live conversations that show the authenticity of a builder, a creator, an entrepreneur. And I think that's something that allows you to really show personality that I don't think AI have or will catch up to anytime soon. One area that I'm definitely thinking a lot about is how do we look at ways to increase intimacy. And intimacy can come in so many different shapes and forms, whether it's more IRL coffees or for us, we're running a lot more micro conferences all around the world. And that's where we're spending a lot of energy and spending a lot of our resources, because if content is can be whipped up in the matter of minutes, you actually don't need a service designer or instructor to be spending hours, weeks, months building a curriculum. You can actually allow them to focus more on connecting, interacting, building rapport with the learners. And even for myself, the way that I think about partnering with clients now, it is how do I get to know them deeper than just a transaction? Because, if you combine it with their career trajectory, moving jobs, switching gears, slowing down, accelerating, you also want to be part of that fun as well. So again, taking long-term views on people and using AI and new age technology to reduce a lot of the operations behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's a winning model, and I think more and more folks in my circle are advocating for that using the time that AI saves us or the optimization that AI offers us to really leverage that instead to make genuine, authentic connections, to your point, right? Because one of the things that I think everybody's becoming aware of this, and the breakneck speed at which these technologies continue to evolve is giving us all pause. There was a famous video, a little TikTok video or Instagram video a couple days ago of an emotional support kangaroo about to board a flight, right? I'm not sure if you've seen that, and I'm not sure if it was a Qantas ad or maybe something related to Australia, but I thought it was a real thing. When my friend shared it with me, I thought it was a real thing. I didn't realize that it was totally doctored by Google VO or whatever that new video engine is, right? So it's when the line between what's real and what's been artificially created uh, becomes more and more blurry. I think the pendulum will swing the other way. I think people are really going to try to move away from, to your point, content is not going to be as important as connection, because connection again is something that is real, raw, vulnerable, can't be replicated by a large language model or by skillful prompt engineering. Uh, it's really, I think, the future of where we're headed in as learners and as educators is really within that sweet spot of trying to find places to offer genuine connection. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, we, as a company, we're design obsessed, and we're obsessed with leveraging new design infrastructure. And even if you look at the disruption that's going to happen within the movie industry, because similar to the whole kangaroo sitch, there's a lot of new tools that's going to aggressively evolve beyond Will Smith eating spaghetti with his four hands. But I think there's a lot of great content around how even actors and actresses should be thinking about positioning. So the way that we explore that space is we still have live coaches that teach programming, and that's again part of facilitation, a part of pushing communities together. But I do think that's also an area worth taking a deeper dive into, especially because even now education businesses, you're either going down the financing route as expansion, or you're going down the AI route. And I guess the question that I'm constantly asking is AI going to be a monopolistic sector where it's going to be run by your Googles, by your Microsofts of the world, and can education companies compete at that stage? Food for thought. But I agree with it's such an exciting time to be building, because you don't need 100 years or 400 years to build a Harvard. You can build that up within months now.
Yeah, and there's a lot. I think there's been a proliferation of these communities that value the dissemination of knowledge, of high quality knowledge, and they're structuring programs in a very thoughtful way to provide value at scale and in a very short amount of time, right? So you mentioned that you're offering these kind of micro conferences, and I think that's a very innovative approach. Again, how do we get people? How do we meet people where they are in their journeys, right? One of the biggest things I think traditionally we've had to face in the world of L&D is treating training or treating upskilling or some kind of learning experience as like you have to set aside time to engage, right? Especially in the corporate environment. If it's been mandated that you go through a certain type of training or learning experience, you got to take time off. You got to do it outside of your day-to-day schedule, right? And yeah, there's value to that. There's value to kind of setting aside time and making it much more of a dedicated experience. But most of the time, I mean, in my day-to-day, right, I enjoy learning that happens in my flow of work and in the way that I'm engaging with whatever I'm happening to be working on at that time, right? So one of the things that I always think about is, as I'm designing learning experiences, I'm working with clients, I'm working with organizations that are looking to adapt the way that they've taught and continue to upskill. We have to figure out how to embed those experiences to the point where the learning becomes a continuous expectation, or it operates as a common thread throughout the person's career, as opposed to being something that is kind of demarcated or distinguished from their day-to-day roles. I'd welcome your thoughts there, Will, because I know you're doing a lot of work in the upskilling space. Are these things that you're noticing as well, learning in the flow of work?
I think the market's definitely evolved significantly from when we first started, because 2016, 2017, L&D was always a nice to have. If anything, the closest painkiller was compliance. And I think the compliance business served a portion of its time, and it took, quite a few years for us to educate the market, especially in Southeast Asia, on why education upskilling was critical for an employee, a team leader, to grow over time. And even for us now, it's constantly quite challenging to figure out how does leadership and management training ultimately support the top line and or bottom line of a business. Because let's be real, for businesses to succeed, whether it's, you know, in the US or in emerging markets, it's how do you actually move the needle in revenue, and how do you build sustainable brands over time. So I do think there's still going to be significant challenge in educating the market, that education needs to play a part, but there's always different ways that you can find entry points to make that happen. I think another thing that I've realized is entrepreneurs like you and I, like those probably listening, learn very differently to employees. And I think that's okay, right? Some folks choose to, treat jobs like a, 9 to 5. And then you also have builders that, make it their life's work, and different styles, different strokes for different folks. So it's so important to be able to cater for that learner profile over time. And I think AI plays a very big part in trying to personalize the efficacy, the impact, and collecting intel at the end of the day. I think one final thing, and this is something that we're learning as well, is the workforce is evolving. So the way that Gen Alpha and Gen Z learn is very different to Gen X and millennials. So thinking through what type of content they consume, what type of KOLs they aspire to become, what type of learning methodologies that work, that's a marriage that we need to constantly figure out, especially at the corporate level that's trying to innovate. More often than not, their learning and experience needs to change every 12 months. So, playing a big part there is, so critical to help L&D, HR teams innovate and be future forward, versus it being a, compliance checkbox.
Yeah, and I think there's impact is always something that we wrestle with in the L&D industry, right? I was at a networking event just an hour or two ago, and one of the folks that I was speaking with said, ROI, ROI. My boss is constantly asking me about ROI, right? And again, many organizations, I think, treat learning as a supplement and not a painkiller, right? Even though problems are exacerbating at the operational level day to day, right? Yet we have to constantly remind leaders and stakeholders that learning is worth investing in, and it'll take time, perhaps, to realize impact. And I mean, we have to define success, but it may take time to actually get to that point where you can categorically say, yes, this is the outcome that we were seeking, and this is how far we've come, right? So I'd love to understand a bit more about this idea of impact, Will. How do the clients and companies and partners that you guys work with, how do they define success and impact?
I think there's so many different layers to talking about this, Farhan. And a good friend of mine who ran and sold a very successful education company, I always, use a phrase that building a startup is already hard. Building it in education is doing it on hard mode. The reason being is you need to serve so many different stakeholders, whether it's the L&D buyer, the end learner, the company, the teacher, the school, the government. And those metrics of success are different across the board. At the learner level, it's, obviously, are you progressing his or her career over time? At the company level, it's how are you moving the needle with goals of the business: revenue, fundraise, expansion, retention of clients. What I've actually found quite refreshing, having built this business for over a decade now, is ultimately comes down to where's the money. And this is something that I took quite a bit of time to unlearn, because when you're starting an education business, you're thinking about impact, scale, number of learners, NPS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're not helping a company grow 2x, 3x a year, at the end of the day, the first thing that gets cut is L&D. And so that's something that I try to coach our founders, our investees, the importance of thinking about the money, because once you're able to manage and control the money, you can upsell and provide your products at the end of the day. And that's why we've found a lot of success in selling to sales teams, to customer success teams, to marketing teams, because it's a lot closer to the revenue of a business. And, especially in Southeast Asia, where a lot of these companies have yet to prove their business model or their hyper blitz scaling, it's so critical to be close to how the C-suite think. Because at the end of the day, the C-suite are the ones that are writing the checks, not the HR. So, I think, for us, we're collecting so much intel around learner performance, career paths, career switching, HR, HR psychological mindset, and how he or she can grow as a HR innovator over time. But, at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and cents. And I think that becomes very clear in showing that you're providing value for an organization.
Yeah, numbers and data-driven, decision making are going to win the day in any boardroom, right? They'll at least get people's attention, and they'll be a good indicator as to whether the ship is sailing in the right direction or whether we need to course correct, right? So I think that's a very valuable takeaway across business as a whole, but something that I think learning leaders, because we tend to be almost naturally heart-centered and human-centered, we sometimes don't want to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the finances and the money piece of it. One of the things that fascinates me about New Campus, Will, and the work that you're doing, you and your team are really spearheading, is the fact that it's a very, I think you take a lot of pride in the fact that you're based in Southeast Asia. Singapore is a global hub for innovation. I've only visited once, but I really enjoyed it there. And I keep telling my friends that it's, we have to move away from certain conceptions that we have or misconceptions that we have in the North American, European framework around where the future of learning and innovation lie. And I think there's tremendous potential and enormous talent to be unlocked in the developing world. Singapore is, of course, a developed country, along with Australia and New Zealand and that corner of the world. But the fact that you have the proximity to a huge chunk of the world's population. I mean, I think I'm kind of an aviation geek, so I always watch these videos on, Changi Airport or, emerging hubs of commerce all over Southeast Asia. I think something like 60% of the world's population lives within a 3-hour flight from Singapore, right? And I mean, just incredible statistics, right? What were some of the reasons that you decided, maybe going back, it's been about 10 years, but why did you and your team decide to operate out of Southeast Asia? And would you say that this region has all this promise that I kind of envisioned that it does?
So we were mid-20s, going to Singapore at the time, and it was deciding whether we go to the US, San Francisco, or go to Singapore. And we ended up serendipitously taking an accelerator offer. So it was, just a stroke of luck. But
Yeah.
if you were to rethink, would I start in Southeast Asia now? I would probably make that decision, you know, 10 times again. And the reason being
Mm.
is when you're trying to innovate in the education space alongside healthcare, it's the hardest industry to crack because of regulation, because of the maturity of brands, because of the maturity of how learners perceive education in markets like Australia, like Europe, like the US. And so, even now, why we're leading in our sectors because competition is still evolving and the learner profile is still super young. And so if you look at markets like Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, there's hundreds of millions of population, even India, where we do some work there, billions of people, but the learning infrastructure is nascent. And so when it comes to thinking about taking that leap forward, it should be exploring markets that allow us to experiment and build arbitrage and support regulation as effective as possible. I think along the way, as NC New Campus also entered the investment space, it allowed us to look at other emerging markets like Africa's, like Latin America, like the MENA region. And so, at the end of the day, it comes down to the thesis of your business. I talk a lot about emerging markets as our strategy, and your strategy is dictated by your position. I think emerging market businesses allow you to rethink education a lot more pragmatically, but also hopefully make a lot more change in an effective way. And I think at the end of the day, when I kind of benchmark us against a US business, completely different metrics because you're working with a different archetype of class. Most of the time, our learners come, as first-time university, graduates from their family. Most of the time, they are, supporting their family for the first time. And I do think that compounds when it comes to the DNA and philosophy of your learners. Would we do the US? We've tried a few times, but at the end of the day, it is a different beast to solve. One area that we're definitely looking at is the student loan space. So we recently launched a debt fund to support student loans. And, on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at Southeast Asia, the student loan market is still so young, whereas the US is a $3 trillion market. So it's really balancing where do you want to create value and where can you create most arbitrage.
It's so fascinating to hear how you have to, as somebody who's a nascent entrepreneur, a year into this journey, I've had to, grapple on, multiple occasions. Where do I want to focus? What do I want to do? What do I want to really solve for? Right? What's the niche that I want to focus on? All these kinds of things. And it's really fascinating to hear that depending on where you are in the world, you've really been able to capture the Southeast Asian psyche and archetype within this work that you do, but you have to tweak that to meet the local requirements, the local pain points of the various regions that you're looking to work into. So, Will, as we kind of reach the tail end of the podcast, I'd love for our listeners to get an idea of your philosophy as a leader, right? So I've labeled all these different roles that you've had over the course of your career. You've been a founder, an educator, an investor. What if these different roles taught you about leadership?
So we recently moved to a 4-day work week. So it's a super risky experiment, but it was, we already had a few team members guinea pig this for the past 6-9 months already. And it was part of our thesis that if you're trying to build sustainable companies for our clients, it's so important to have sustenance for our employees too. And so this actually goes quite against our former self, which was growth at all cost, hire fast, fire fast. And so far the experiment has been great where 2 months in, we're seeing significantly increased output from the team, and the team is happy. They're spending a lot more time with their families. They're also starting families themselves. And what that says for me is you need to take a long-term view on people. I didn't imagine running a business for 10 years, and now I can see myself doing it for the next 20 or 30. And so when you think about building a 30-year-old business, 40-year-old brand, 50-year-old legacy, it does come down to relationships and people. And Farhan, and as we mentioned at the start of this podcast, community is key. I think community starts with your company. Community starts with your team. Community starts with the people that you're going to ride to war with. And we've been, constantly evolving our practice as an organization to hopefully shine light into how other managers and leaders all around SCA and beyond can think about creating these fundamental environments to help everyone around them move forward and succeed. Maybe another thing that I'm, personally scratching an itch for is how do we constantly, provide these opportunities for people to eventually leave the company, because what's been super successful with the new campus ecosystem is you need people to outgrow you. You need them to move on. You need them to step into other uncomfortable positions. So once we feel like we can't provide that uncomfortable environment, it's a great time for us to part ways and hopefully build a much wider community, using that formula. So yeah, I think at the end of the day we're evolving as a company, but thinking long term about relationships.
I think that's a very wise and, something that you really, that's a takeaway that you kind of distill after you've had the years of learning that you've had as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's grown a business. So it's a very salient takeaway for listeners who are kind of in that position where they're trying to gauge which levers to pull to be able to achieve certain outcomes. And people first organizations, I think 4-day work weeks, I think, are a phenomenal idea. I think it would do a lot of good when it comes to mental health, when it comes to productivity, when it comes to work-life balance across the world. I wish more and more companies were kind of spearheading it, and it entered the cultural conversation maybe a bit more forcefully, at least in the U.S. But I think those are some very salient takeaways for our audience. Where can our listeners learn more about you, New Campus, the work you do? I'd love to put those in the show notes, but I'd want to hear that from you as well.
LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm quite active there. Right now, being a father, I will be locked in home for a while, but I'm always up for coffees if you're in town. I'm also floating around for conferences, so feel free to hit me up. But yeah, the best way to reach out is through socials. I'm just a DM and away.
Fantastic. Well, that's how we first connected, and it's been a great couple of conversations that we've had, and it's been a joy to have you on the show. I will continue to follow the work that you're doing at New Campus, and for sure you can count me in for an in-person meeting the next time I'm in Singapore, or if you're in my neck of the woods.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Will.